evening was calm, with a gentle breeze rustling through the trees lining the quiet suburban streets. Rear Admiral Marcus Holloway, a man known for his distinguished career and unwavering dedication to service, had just wrapped up a community outreach event at a local school. The event had been uplifting. Students asked thoughtful questions about leadership, teamwork, and how to make a difference in their communities. Marcus felt hopeful as he slid into the driver's seat of his car. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was nearly 9 p.m., and all he wanted now was to get home, unwind, and reflect on the meaningful conversations he'd had that night. As Marcus drove down the familiar roads, he noticed the soft glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. It was peaceful, almost serene. But then, without warning, flashing red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. His heart skipped a beat. At first he thought perhaps there was some emergency behind him. But when the lights stayed fixed on his vehicle, he realized they were meant for him. Confused, Marcus signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, making sure to stop in a well-lit area where both he and the officers could see clearly. He turned off the engine and rolled down his window, waiting patiently. Within moments, 2 police cars screeched to a halt behind him, their doors slamming shut almost simultaneously. 4 officers emerged, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. One of them, a tall man with a stern expression, approached Marcus's car swiftly, his voice sharp and commanding. "Step out of the vehicle, hands where I can see them," he barked. Marcus froze for a split second. He hadn't done anything wrong. Why were they treating him like a criminal? Quickly regaining his composure, he raised his hand slightly above the steering wheel, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Officer," he said calmly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Can you tell me what this is about?" But the officer didn't respond. Instead, he yanked open the car door and ordered Marcus to step out. Another officer joined him, shining a flashlight directly into Marcus's face. "Do you know why we stopped you?" the lead officer demanded, his tone dripping with suspicion. "No, sir, I don't," Marcus replied politely. "I'm happy to cooperate, but I'd like to understand what's going on." At this point, Marcus reached slowly toward the glove compartment, intending to retrieve his military ID. Before he could even touch it, however, one of the officers shouted, "Stop right there! Keep your hands where we can see them." Their voices grew louder, more aggressive. Marcus froze again, his mind racing. This wasn't how traffic stops were supposed to go. Something felt deeply wrong. Despite the tension, Marcus tried to remain calm. He spoke slowly and deliberately, hoping to diffuse the situation. "Officers, my name is Rear Admiral Marcus Holloway. I'm active duty Navy. I have identification here if you'll allow me to show it." He emphasized his rank, thinking it might help clarify the misunderstanding. After all, how many people could claim such credentials? But instead of easing the tension, his words seemed to enrage the lead officer further. "We'll decide who you are," the man snapped, his hand tightening around the grip of his weapon. "Get out of the car now, or we will remove you ourselves." By now, several neighbors had stepped outside, drawn by the commotion. Some stood on their porches, watching nervously, while others peered through curtains, unsure of what was happening. A few began recording the scene on their phones, capturing the surreal moment unfolding before them. Marcus could feel eyes on him, but he kept his focus on the officers, determined not to escalate things further. He complied with their orders, stepping out of the car with deliberate slowness. His hands remained raised, palms open, as he faced the officers. "I'm unarmed," he said firmly yet respectfully. "I'm just trying to explain who I am." For a brief moment, silence hung in the air. Then, one of the junior officers, a younger man who looked uneasy, spoke up hesitantly. "Sir, do you really have ID?" he asked, his voice quieter than the others. Marcus nodded. "Yes, in the glove box. May I retrieve it?" The lead officer shot the younger man a glare before reluctantly nodding. "Go ahead, but move slowly," he growled. Marcus carefully opened the glove compartment and pulled out his military ID, holding it up for the officers to inspect. Even in the dim light, the gold insignia gleamed brightly against the dark leather casing. At first, none of the officers reacted. They stared at the ID, then back at Marcus, as if struggling to reconcile the image of the man standing before them with the assumptions they'd made. Finally, one of them muttered under his breath, "This doesn't look fake." Still, the lead officer refused to back down. "That proves nothing," he insisted, though his confidence seemed to waver slightly. Marcus knew he couldn't reason with these men alone. Every instinct told him to stay calm, to avoid giving them any excuse to escalate further. Yet deep down, anger simmered beneath his composed exterior. How dare they treat him this way? He had served his country honorably for decades, risking his life to protect freedoms that should extend to everyone, including himself. And yet here he was, standing on the side of the road, surrounded by armed officers who saw him not as a decorated officer, but as a threat simply because of the color of his skin. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as the standoff continued. Each passing second felt heavier than the last, the weight of injustice pressing down on Marcus's shoulders. Little did he know, this encounter would spark a chain reaction far beyond what anyone present could have imagined. For now, though, all he could do was wait and hope that cooler heads would prevail before the situation spiraled further out of control. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to feel like a physical weight pressing down on everyone present. Marcus stood still, his hands raised high, his breath steady despite the chaos swirling around him. The lead officer, whose name, Tag Reed Grayson, paced back and forth in front of Marcus, his boots crunching against the gravel on the side of the road. Grayson's face was flushed with anger, his jaw clenched tightly as if he were trying to maintain control over the situation. Or, perhaps himself. "You think flashing some ID is going to get you out of this?" Grayson growled, his voice cutting through the quiet night. He grabbed the military ID from Marcus's hand and held it up to the light of his flashlight, squinting at it suspiciously. "How do we know this isn't fake? You could have gotten this off the street for all we know." Marcus wanted to protest, to explain that forging a Rear Admiral's identification card wasn't something one could casually pull off, but he bit his tongue. He knew better than to argue with someone who had already made up their mind. Instead, he spoke calmly, his tone measured and respectful. "Officer, I'm telling you the truth. I'm Rear Admiral Marcus Holloway. If you call Naval Command right, now they'll confirm my identity." Grayson scoffed, shaking his head dismissively. "Oh sure, let me just pick up the phone and dial the Pentagon while we're standing here," he sneered. His sarcasm dripped heavily, and Marcus could see the other officers exchanging uneasy glances. Even among them, there seemed to be a divide. Some appeared hesitant, unsure whether to trust Grayson's judgment or question it. One of the younger officers, a man who looked barely old enough to shave, shifted uncomfortably. His eyes darted between Marcus and Grayson, clearly torn. "Sir," he began cautiously, addressing Grayson, "maybe we should check this out before..." "Before what?" Grayson snapped, cutting him off mid-sentence. His glare silenced the younger officer instantly. "You want to take his word over mine? Over protocol? Is that what you're saying?" The younger officer swallowed hard and took a step back, retreating into silence. Marcus noticed the exchange and felt a pang of sympathy for the kid. He recognized the fear in the young man's eyes, the same fear that often kept people silent when they knew something wasn't right. It was a look Marcus had seen too many times before, both in the military and in civilian life. Fear of authority, fear of speaking up, fear of consequences. As the standoff dragged on, Marcus became increasingly aware of the growing audience. Neighbors continued to gather, some whispering nervously to each other, others filming the scene on their phones. A few brave souls called out from their porches, asking what was happening. "Is everything okay?" one woman asked timidly. "Why are you stopping him?" Grayson spun around, pointing his flashlight toward the crowd. "This is police business," he shouted, his voice harsh and commanding. "Stay back or you'll be next." The warning sent a ripple of unease through the onlookers, but no one moved. They stayed rooted to their spots, watching intently. Some recorded silently, while others murmured prayers under their breath. One teenager, perched on the hood of a car parked across the street, leaned forward eagerly, her phone camera trained directly on Marcus. She didn't say a word, but her wide eyes conveyed a mix of curiosity and concern. Meanwhile, Marcus tried to focus on staying calm. He repeated a mantra in his head. Breathe. Stay composed. Don't give them a reason to escalate. But it was getting harder by the second. Every passing moment felt like an eternity, and the weight of the injustice bearing down on him was almost suffocating. Here he was, a decorated officer, a respected leader, a father, a husband, and yet these men refused to see him as anything more than a stereotype. To them, he wasn't Rear Admiral Marcus Holloway. He was just another black man driving a nice car, guilty until proven innocent. Grayson's aggression only intensified. He began circling Marcus slowly, his flashlight beam sweeping over Marcus's body as though searching for something incriminating. What were you doing in this neighborhood anyway? Grayson demanded, his tone accusatory. This isn't your part of town. Marcus blinked, caught off guard by the insinuation. I live here, he replied evenly. This is my community. Grayson stopped pacing and stared at Marcus, his lips curling into a smirk. Yeah, right, sure you do. And I suppose you own a yacht too? The comment stung. Not because it was clever, but because it was so painfully predictable. Marcus resisted, the urge to roll his eyes. He'd heard remarks like this countless times throughout his life. Comments meant to belittle, to undermine, to remind him that no matter how far he climbed, some people would always see him as less than. But tonight, standing under the harsh glare of a flashlight with guns pointed in his direction, the words carried a sharper sting. Just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any worse, another patrol car arrived, its siren wailing briefly before falling silent. Out stepped Sergeant Linda Hayes, a veteran officer known for her level-headedness and fairness. She surveyed the scene quickly, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, the tense posture of the officers, the frightened expressions of the bystanders, and Marcus standing calmly but firmly in the center of it all. What's going on here? Hayes asked, her voice firm but not unkind. Grayson immediately launched into an explanation, his words tumbling out in a rushed jumble. We got a report about a suspicious vehicle matching this description, he said, gesturing vaguely toward Marcus's car. When we pulled him over, he refused to comply and started reaching for things in his car. We're handling it. Hayes raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. She turned her attention to Marcus, her demeanor softening slightly. Sir, can you tell me your name? Rear Admiral Marcus Holloway. Marcus replied, meeting her gaze steadily. I've been cooperative since the stop began. I showed them my military ID, but Officer Grayson seems unwilling to accept it. Hayes frowned, glancing at Grayson, who shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. Without waiting for further explanation, she took the ID from Grayson's hand and examined it herself. Her expression changed almost immediately. Recognition dawned on her face, followed by disbelief and then, unmistakably, anger. Not at Marcus, but at the absurdity of the situation. This is legitimate, Hayes said sharply, holding the ID up for Grayson to see. And even if it weren't, you don't treat someone like this without cause, especially not someone of his rank. Her voice carried a note of authority that brooked no argument. Grayson opened his mouth to respond, but Hayes cut him off with a single raised hand. Stand down, she ordered, her tone leaving no room for debate. Turning back, to Marcus she offered a curt apology. Admiral Holloway, I deeply regret this misunderstanding. Please allow us to escort you safely home. Marcus nodded, relief washing over him like a wave. For the first time since the ordeal began, he lowered his hands, letting them fall to his sides. As Hayes ushered him back to his car, the other officers dispersed reluctantly, muttering amongst themselves. Grayson lingered for a moment longer, his face twisted in frustration, before finally climbing into his patrol car and speeding away. Though the immediate danger had passed, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was far from over. As he drove home under the watchful eyes of Sergeant Hayes' squad car, he replayed the events in his mind, dissecting every word, every action. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been profiled, stereotyped, or mistreated simply because of the color of their skin. And he also knew that this wasn't the end of the story. Far from it. By the time Marcus arrived home, escorted by Sergeant Hayes and her team, the adrenaline coursing through his veins had begun to ebb. But the anger simmering beneath the surface remained, a slow-burning fire that refused to be extinguished. He thanked Hayes for her intervention, his tone polite yet distant as he stepped out of his car and onto the driveway. The quiet familiarity of his house offered little comfort. The events of the evening replayed in his mind like a broken record, each loop amplifying his frustration. Inside, Marcus's wife, Evelyn, was waiting. She had seen the flashing lights from their bedroom window and immediately called him, only to find his phone going straight to voicemail. Panic set in when she noticed social media posts about a traffic stop gone wrong in their neighborhood. When she finally heard the knock on the door and saw Marcus standing there, relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. One look at his face told her everything she needed to know. "What happened?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling with concern. Marcus sighed deeply, running a hand over his face before sinking into a chair at the kitchen table. For a few moments, he didn't speak. He just stared at the wood grain of the tabletop, trying to collect his thoughts. Finally, he began recounting the night's events, the sudden stop, the aggressive officers, the refusal to acknowledge his credentials, and the humiliating treatment he endured. Evelyn listened intently, her hands clasped tightly together. Her eyes welled up with tears, but she blinked them away, determined to stay strong for her husband. "This can't go unpunished," she said firmly. "You're not just anyone, Marcus. You're a Rear Admiral. If they can treat you this way, imagine what happens to people who don't have your rank or connections." Marcus nodded slowly. He knew she was right. This wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who faced similar situations daily, without the privilege of a title to protect them. As much as he wanted to retreat into the safety of his home and forget the whole ordeal, he couldn't ignore the bigger picture. This incident was a symptom of a much larger problem, one that demanded attention and action. The next morning, Marcus woke early, unable to sleep. News outlets had already picked up the story, fueled by videos posted online by neighbors who witnessed the confrontation. Social media was ablaze with reactions. Outrage, disbelief, and calls for accountability dominated the conversation. Hashtags like "Nossing Justice for Holloway" and "End Racial Profiling" trended nationwide, drawing attention not only to Marcus's case, but also to the systemic issues plaguing law enforcement. Marcus scrolled through the posts, reading comments from strangers who expressed solidarity and shared their own experiences of racial profiling. Some recounted harrowing tales of being pulled over for no reason, while others spoke of loved ones who hadn't made it home after encounters with police. Each story added another layer of weight to Marcus's shoulders, reinforcing his resolve to do something meaningful. Later that day, Marcus held a press conference outside his home. Reporters gathered eagerly, microphones thrust forward, cameras rolling. Despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him, Marcus exuded calmness and dignity as he addressed the crowd. Standing behind a makeshift podium, flanked by Evelyn and members of a local civil rights organization, he spoke clearly and deliberately. "This isn't about me," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the storm brewing within. "Yes, I'm a Rear Admiral. Yes, I've dedicated my life to serving this country. But last night, none of that mattered. To those officers, I was nothing more than a black man driving a car, a stereotype they chose to act upon without question." The crowd fell silent, hanging on every word. Marcus continued, his tone firm but not accusatory. "What happened to me is unacceptable, it's dehumanizing, and it's not an isolated incident. This kind of behavior perpetuates fear and mistrust between communities and law enforcement. We cannot continue down this path. Change is long overdue." Paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "I will not let this moment pass without demanding accountability. Officer Grayson and his colleagues must answer for their actions, not because I seek revenge, but because justice requires it. Accountability is the first step toward healing, and healing is essential if we ever hope to move forward. The audience erupted in applause, some people nodding in agreement, others wiping away tears. Marcus's speech struck a chord, resonating with those who had experienced similar injustices and galvanizing allies eager to support the cause. By the end of the press conference, hashtags related to the incident were trending globally, sparking conversations about racial bias, police reform, and systemic inequality. Behind the scenes, however, tensions were mounting. Within hours of the press conference, internal investigations were launched against the officers involved in the traffic stop. Body camera footage was reviewed meticulously, revealing damning evidence of misconduct. Grayson's aggressive behavior, coupled with his blatant disregard for protocol, painted a clear picture of abuse of power. Even worse, transcripts of the officers' radio communications showed that the initial description leading to the stop, a suspicious black man in an expensive car, was vague and racially charged. Public pressure mounted rapidly. Protesters took to the streets in cities across the country, holding signs that read, "Black Lives Matter" and "Accountability Now." Community leaders organized rallies, urging citizens to demand transparency and reform. Meanwhile, politicians weighed in, calling for swift action to address the glaring flaws exposed by Marcus's case. Grayson, meanwhile, found himself under intense scrutiny. His superiors placed him on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. Isolated from his colleagues and ostracized by the public, Grayson grew increasingly defensive. In interviews with investigators, he doubled down on his actions, insisting that he had followed proper procedure and that Marcus's rank was irrelevant to the situation. "I was doing my job," he argued. "How was I supposed to know he was telling the truth?" His arguments fell flat, especially when contrasted with the testimonies of eyewitnesses and the junior officer who had hesitated during the stop. That officer, whose name was Officer Rodriguez, came forward voluntarily, providing a detailed account of the events. He admitted feeling uneasy about the way Grayson handled the situation and expressed regret for not speaking up sooner. "I should have said something," Rodriguez confessed during an emotional interview. "But I was scared. Scared of what might happen if I questioned him. Looking back, I realize silence is complicity. I won't make that mistake again." Rodriguez's testimony became a turning point in the investigation. It highlighted not only Grayson's misconduct, but also the culture of intimidation within the department, a culture that discouraged dissent and enabled abusive behavior to go unchecked. Calls for sweeping reforms grew louder, with activists pushing for measures such as mandatory bias training, independent oversight boards, and stricter consequences for officers who violated policies. As the investigation unfolded, Marcus remained steadfast in his advocacy. He attended town hall meetings, met with lawmakers, and collaborated with grassroots organizations to draft proposals for systemic change. His efforts inspired others to share their stories, creating a ripple effect that amplified the movement. People from all walks of life joined the fight, united by a shared desire for justice and equality. Despite the progress being made, Marcus understood that real change wouldn't come overnight. It would require patience, persistence, and unwavering commitment. But he also knew that moments like this, painful though they were, had the power to ignite transformation. As he stood on the front lines of the battle for reform, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about holding one officer accountable. It was about building a future where no one had to endure what he did simply because of the color of their skin. And for Marcus, that made every challenge worth facing. The weeks that followed Marcus's traffic stop were a whirlwind of activity, both for him personally and for the broader movement his case had ignited. The internal investigation into Officer Grayson and his colleagues progressed rapidly, fueled by mounting public pressure and undeniable evidence from body cameras and witness testimonies. Every new detail that emerged painted a damning portrait of misconduct, bias, and systemic failure within the police department. Grayson's defense, that he was simply doing his job, crumbled under scrutiny. Investigators uncovered troubling patterns in his past behavior, including multiple complaints of racial profiling and excessive force that had been swept under the rug due to lack of evidence or institutional inertia. One particularly chilling revelation came from a former colleague who described Grayson as having a chip on his shoulder when it came to interactions with people of color. He always said they were guilty until proven innocent, the whistleblower recounted during an interview. It didn't matter if they were doctors, lawyers, or military officers. They were all the same to him. As these revelations surfaced, public outrage reached a fever pitch. Protesters gathered outside police headquarters daily, chanting slogans like "No justice, no peace," and holding banners emblazoned with Marcus's name. Social media played a pivotal role in amplifying their voices, with videos of marches and rallies going viral overnight. Celebrities, activists, and even high-ranking government officials joined the chorus, calling for accountability and reform. Marcus himself became a symbol of resilience, a man who refused to let one terrible night define him, but instead used it as a catalyst for change. Meanwhile, legal proceedings against Grayson moved forward swiftly. Prosecutors presented a compelling case, citing not only the events of the traffic stop, but also the broader context of systemic racism within law enforcement. They argued that Grayson's actions were not merely an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of abuse enabled by outdated policies and unchecked power. For the first time in recent memory, there was a real possibility that an officer accused of racial profiling would face significant consequences. The trial captivated the nation. Courtrooms overflowed with spectators eager to witness history unfold, while millions more tuned in via live streams and news coverage. Grayson took the stand in his own defense, attempting to portray himself as a victim of circumstance rather than a perpetrator of injustice. "I was following protocol," he insisted repeatedly, his voice tinged with frustration. "You can't expect me to trust everyone who hands me a piece of paper claiming to be someone important." But the prosecution dismantled his arguments methodically. Expert witnesses testified about proper procedures for handling traffic stops, involving individuals of high rank, emphasizing that respect and verification, not aggression, were standard practice. Other officers, including Sergeant Hayes and Officer Rodriguez, provided first-hand accounts of how Grayson deviated from accepted norms. Their testimonies carried particular weight, given their insider perspectives and willingness to speak out. Despite potential backlash, perhaps most impactful was Marcus's testimony. When he stepped onto the witness stand, dressed in his full naval uniform, the courtroom fell silent. His presence commanded respect, and his words resonated deeply. Speaking directly to the jury, Marcus recounted the humiliation and fear he felt during the stop, describing how each aggressive command from Grayson chipped away at his dignity. "I've faced danger before in combat zones on missions where lives hung in the balance," he said, his voice steady, yet filled with emotion. "But nothing prepared me for the feeling of helplessness I experienced that night. It wasn't just about me being disrespected. It was about realizing that no amount of service or sacrifice could shield me from prejudice." His testimony struck a chord, not only with the jury, but also with viewers watching at home. Many saw themselves, or their loved ones, in Marcus's story, recognizing the shared pain of being judged not by character but by appearance. Tears flowed freely in the courtroom as Marcus concluded his remarks, leaving no doubt about the gravity of what had transpired. When the verdict was finally delivered, it sent shockwaves across the country. Grayson was found guilty on multiple counts, including misconduct, racial profiling, and abuse of authority. In a landmark decision, the judge sentenced him to 2 years in prison, making him one of the few officers in recent history to face tangible consequences for such actions. The ruling was met with cheers outside the courthouse, where supporters celebrated what they saw as a small but significant victory in the fight for justice. For Marcus, however, the sentencing marked not the end of his journey, but the beginning of a new chapter. While he felt a sense of vindication, he knew that true progress required more than punishing one individual. It demanded systemic change, changes that wouldn't happen overnight, but could be achieved through persistent effort and collaboration. In the months that followed, Marcus threw himself into advocacy work with renewed vigor. He partnered with civil rights organizations to draft legislation aimed at addressing racial bias in policing. Among the proposals were measures requiring independent oversight boards to review complaints against officers, mandatory de-escalation, training for all law enforcement personnel, and stricter penalties for violations of protocol. Marcus traveled extensively, meeting with lawmakers, community leaders, and grassroots activists to build support for these initiatives. One of his most impactful efforts came in the form of a nationwide tour called Bridging Divides. Through this initiative, Marcus visited cities ravaged by tension between law enforcement and marginalized communities, facilitating dialogues designed to foster understanding and mutual respect. These discussions weren't easy. Emotions often ran high and disagreements sometimes erupted, but they were necessary. By bringing people together, Marcus hoped to break down barriers and create space for meaningful change. His message resonated far beyond the communities he visited. Media outlets covered his efforts extensively, highlighting stories of reconciliation and progress. A documentary chronicling his journey, from the night of the traffic stop to his role as a champion of reform, aired on national television, further amplifying his mission. Viewers were moved by his courage and determination, inspired to take action in their own corners of the world. Despite the successes, Marcus remained acutely aware of the challenges ahead. Change was slow, and resistance was inevitable. Some critics dismissed his efforts as naive or idealistic, arguing that systemic issues couldn't be solved by goodwill alone. Others accused him of overstepping, suggesting that a military officer shouldn't involve himself in matters of civilian law enforcement. But Marcus brushed off the negativity, focusing instead on the countless individuals who stood beside him in solidarity. At home, Evelyn served as his rock, offering unwavering support and encouragement. Together, they navigated the emotional toll of reliving the trauma while celebrating the victories, no matter how small. Their children, too, became involved in the movement, organizing youth-led initiatives to educate peers about racial justice and allyship. The Holloway family transformed their personal pain into a collective force for good, proving that even in the darkest moments, light could shine through. By the time the year drew to a close, Marcus's impact was undeniable. Laws had been passed, policies rewritten, and conversations sparked that might never have happened otherwise. Yet he knew the work was far from finished. Racial bias and inequality were deeply entrenched problems, requiring sustained commitment to dismantle. Still, Marcus approached the future with hope, buoyed by the knowledge that every step forward, even the smallest ones, brought society closer to a world where everyone was treated with fairness and respect. For Marcus, the ordeal had been a painful reminder of the injustices that persisted in the world. But it had also reinforced his belief in the power of resilience and unity. As he looked ahead, he envisioned a legacy not defined by the night he was held at gunpoint, but by the countless lives touched and changed for the better because of his refusal to stay silent. Months turned into years, and Marcus's relentless pursuit of justice transformed him from a victim of racial profiling into a beacon of hope for millions. What started as a personal ordeal had grown into a national movement, one that transcended borders, cultures, and generations. His story became a testament to the power of resilience, courage, and collective action in the face of systemic injustice. The changes he helped usher in were not immediate, nor were they perfect. Reforming deeply entrenched systems took time, patience, and constant vigilance. Yet Marcus's efforts yielded tangible results. New laws were enacted at both state and federal levels, mandating stricter accountability for law enforcement officers. Independent oversight boards were established in cities across the country, ensuring that complaints against police misconduct were investigated thoroughly and impartially. Training programs focused on cultural sensitivity, implicit bias, and de-escalation techniques became mandatory for all officers, replacing outdated practices that prioritized force over communication. Marcus also played a key role in launching the National Initiative for Equity in Policing, NIP, an organization dedicated to fostering trust between law enforcement agencies and the communities they served. The initiative brought together experts from diverse fields, law enforcement, academia, psychology, and civil rights advocacy, to develop innovative strategies for addressing racial disparities in policing. One of its flagship programs paired officers with community leaders for joint training sessions, encouraging open dialogue and collaboration. These workshops weren't always easy. Tensions flared, and uncomfortable truths surfaced. But through honest conversations, participants began to see each other as human beings rather than adversaries. Slowly but surely, bridges were built where walls once stood. Beyond policy changes, Marcus's influence extended to education and awareness campaigns aimed at younger generations. Schools adopted curricula designed to teach students about racial equity, empathy, and civic responsibility. Youth summits inspired by Marcus's work sprang up nationwide, empowering young people to become agents of change in their own communities. Many of these initiatives were spearheaded by his own children, who had grown into passionate advocates in their own right. Their involvement gave Marcus immense pride, knowing that the fight for justice would continue long after he was gone. The years passed. Marcus found solace in the progress being made, but he never forgot the night that changed everything. He often reflected on how close he had come to tragedy, how easily things could have spiraled out of control. Those reflections kept him grounded, reminding him of the stakes involved in this ongoing struggle. It wasn't just about policies or statistics. It was about lives. Lives like his. Lives like those of the countless individuals whose stories he had heard along the way. Stories of fear, pain, and resilience. One particularly poignant moment came during a visit to a small town in the Midwest where Marcus attended a community forum organized by local activists. A young woman named Tasha approached the microphone, her voice trembling as she shared her experience of losing her brother to police violence. "He was only 22, she said, tears streaming down her face. He hadn't done anything wrong, but they didn't give him a chance to explain. They saw him as a threat because of the color of his skin." The room fell silent as Tasha spoke, her words heavy with grief yet laced with determination. When she finished, Marcus stepped forward and embraced her, offering words of comfort and solidarity. Later, during his speech, he acknowledged Tasha's bravery and vowed to honor her brother's memory by continuing the fight for justice. "We owe it to them," he told the crowd. "To every name we know and every name we'll never hear. We owe it to them to keep pushing forward, no matter how hard it gets." Such moments reinforced Marcus's belief that true change required more than legislation or policy reforms. It required compassion, understanding, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. He understood that dismantling systemic racism wasn't something one person or even one generation could achieve alone. It was a collective effort, requiring the participation of everyone willing to listen, learn, and act. Despite the challenges, there were moments of triumph that reminded Marcus why the fight was worth it. One such moment occurred when a bill he had championed for years, the Accountability and Transparency in Law Enforcement Act, was signed into law by Congress. The legislation mandated body cameras for all officers, created a national database to track incidents of misconduct, and provided funding for community-based policing initiatives. Standing alongside lawmakers, activists, and survivors of police brutality at the signing ceremony, Marcus felt a surge of pride. This victory belonged not to him alone, but to everyone who had fought tirelessly for justice. Another milestone came, when Marcus received an honorary doctorate from a prestigious university, recognizing his contributions to social justice and public service. During his acceptance speech, he humbly thanked those who had supported him throughout his journey, from Evelyn and his family to the strangers who had rallied behind him during his darkest hour. "This award isn't mine," he said, holding up the diploma. "It belongs to every person who has ever stood up against injustice, no matter how daunting the odds. To every voice that refused to be silenced, every hand that reached out in solidarity, and every heart that believed in a better future even when hope seemed distant." His words resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom rose to their feet in applause. Among them was Officer Rodriguez, the junior officer who had hesitated during the traffic stop but later found the courage to speak out. Now working as a trainer for the NIA, Rodriguez had dedicated himself to educating fellow officers about the importance of accountability and empathy. After the ceremony, he approached Marcus with gratitude in his eyes. "You saved me," Rodriguez said simply. "You showed me what real leadership looks like. I wouldn't be here without you." Marcus smiled warmly, shaking his hand. "No, son," he replied. "You saved yourself. And now you're saving others. That's what this is all about." As Marcus entered the twilight of his career, he began mentoring the next generation of leaders, men and women committed to carrying the torch of justice forward. He founded the Holloway Institute for Leadership and Equity, a nonprofit organization focused on developing skills in advocacy, negotiation, and coalition building. Through workshops, seminars, and mentorship programs, the Institute equipped emerging leaders with the tools they needed to effect meaningful change in their communities. Though retirement loomed on the horizon, Marcus showed no signs of slowing down. His days were filled with speaking engagements, meetings with policymakers, and visits to schools and community centers. Each interaction reminded him of the ripple effect created by standing up for what was right. Whether addressing a packed auditorium or sharing a quiet conversation with a single individual, Marcus knew that every word mattered. Every story told had the potential to inspire someone else to take action. In his final years, Marcus wrote a memoir titled From Shadows to Light, My Journey Toward Justice. The book chronicled his life, from his humble beginnings as the son of sharecroppers to his rise through the ranks of the Navy and his transformation into a champion of reform. It was raw, honest, and deeply personal, capturing not only the highs and lows of his journey but also the lessons he had learned along the way. Upon its release, the memoir became an instant bestseller, praised for its insight, vulnerability, and call to action. Marcus dedicated the book to Evelyn, his partner in every sense of the word, and to the countless unnamed heroes whose sacrifices paved the way for progress. In the epilogue, he wrote, "Justice is not a destination, it is a journey that requires us to confront our fears, challenge our assumptions, and extend grace to one another. It is messy, imperfect, and often painful. But it is also beautiful, transformative, and necessary. Together, we can turn shadows into light." When Marcus passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 84, the world mourned the loss of a giant. Tributes poured in from around the globe, celebrating his legacy as a trailblazer, advocate, and visionary. Flags flew at half-staff, outside naval bases, and vigils were held in cities worldwide. His funeral was attended by dignitaries, activists, and ordinary citizens alike, all united in honoring a man who had given so much to make the world a better place. But perhaps the greatest tribute to Marcus's life was the enduring impact of his work. Years after his passing, communities continued to thrive thanks to the foundations he had laid. Young leaders carried his teachings into new arenas, tackling issues ranging from climate justice to economic inequality. Schools bore his name, scholarships were established in his honor, and statues commemorating his contributions stood tall in public squares. Most importantly, the spirit of resilience and unity that Marcus embodied lived on in the hearts of those he touched. Long after the headlines faded and the memorials crumbled, his message remained etched in the collective consciousness, that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person's courage could spark a movement capable of changing the world. And so, Rear Admiral Marcus Holloway's legacy endured, not as a relic of the past but as a living, breathing force driving humanity toward a brighter,